Recording now. Thank you kindly. I'm going to just move you over to the attendees, Jim. Our Uber judge for the session is Kevin Harrington. He'll be supported by Carrie, John, and Fred. I'll hand it over to Kevin now to talk about our agenda and all of the proceedings we'll have for our session this evening. Take it away, Kevin.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for preparing and the work you've done to get here, and in particular, organizing your arguments around the parts of the case we're going to discuss. I've been with IBEC for several years. It's something I look forward to each and every year. I always learn something. I'm sure I will today. I'm originally from the New England area. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm a director for research and development in urology and critical care at Becton Dickinson. So I'll let the other judges introduce themselves. First, actually, why don't we go ahead and do that? We'll let the other judges introduce themselves, and I'll read a background on full presentation session.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Fred Kipperman. I'm in Los Angeles. I'm a lawyer by training with a deep interest in corporate ethics, but this was the session that I most wanted to be a part of because I think that climate change and climate resilience are two of the most important topics that we face as a society. So I want to tip my cap to the students for picking such an important topic, and want to thank IBEC for the opportunity to be inspired by the volunteers and the students. And with that, I'll defer.
All right, hello everybody. I'm Carrie Penman. I'm the Chief Risk and Compliance Officer for NAVEX, which is an ethics and compliance, risk and compliance software company. We do hotlines and training and policy management and integrated risk management for about 13,000 customers around the world. And I've been involved in IBEC for at least 3 or 4 years now. I'm very excited for this session and to meet all of you and to hear your presentations and to learn more from all of you. As Kevin said, I learn something new every year when I attend these sessions. So just really happy and proud to be part of this organization and to have this chance to hear from all of you.
Hi, my name is John Truslow, and I'm the Director of Ethics and Business Conduct for BAE Systems. BAE is, depending on how you count, either the 3rd or 4th largest defense company in the world. And this part of BAE is headquartered here in Southern New Hampshire in Nashua. My experience with IBEC goes back a ways. I used to be a coach of an ethics bowl team at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis and competed in this very competition something like 20 years ago. So I'm looking forward to being a part today.
Gosh, John, I think I remember that team, and if I remember, they won as well. So I'm glad to see if you stayed with ethics. Clearly, you've got a balance for it. I'm going to go ahead and read the background for the full presentation session. In this part of the competition, you are taking on a fictional business identity and assigning a fictional business identity to the 4 of us, the judges. Please make sure everyone knows who you are and who they are before you begin. You will have 25 minutes with a 5-minute cushion. I'll keep time to describe the legal, financial, and ethical dimensions of the problem and to recommend a solution that passes muster on all 3 counts. During this time, teams will be uninterrupted. When you are finished, the judges will ask you questions for 20 minutes. During the Q&A, both you and the judges will stay in character. After the Q&A, the judges will give you feedback outside of the role playing. I'll let folks know when we come out of character. Some important things to keep in mind. The ethical aspects of your analysis are the most important part. However, these should be described in a simple, practical, common sense fashion. Using technical philosophical terminology or basing your argument on religious or theological grounds will be considered a serious weakness. During this presentation, every member of the team must have some sort of speaking role. Okay, so any questions on sort of the ground rules? Very good. Again, I'll keep time during our time together. And Stetson team, if you would begin when you're ready.
Hello, judges. My name is Sadie Jensen. 1 second. Can I have permission to share my screen, please?
Yes, please do.
It says that I don't have access to it.
Can you check that out?
Be fixed now.
It's working now. I'm pulling it up right now.
Apologies for that, team.
No worries. Thank you so much. Okay. Hello, judges. My name is Sadie Jensen. My name is Audrey Burley.
And I'm Amandine Lewis Charles.
Today, we ask you to assume the role of the International Code Council, hereafter referred to as the ICC. The ICC is a nonprofit organization that is responsible for writing model building codes that are often adopted by local and state jurisdictions. We are facing a climate crisis today. What can be done? Let's begin with an exploration of the bigger picture, a look into the goals that we've already set to improve our global environment by 2030. The Paris Climate Agreement aims to lower the 10-year increase in global temperatures to just 2 degrees Celsius. In order for this goal to be accomplished, the world needs to see about 3 billion electric vehicles in use by the year 2040. But many specific actions taken by many specific stakeholders must be accomplished for us to reach these goals. From large governmental actions to changing global business practices to modifying individual household daily routines, all of these can be influenced by the codes that the ICC creates. Imagine, for example, if new building codes required every home to have an outlet for electric vehicles to be charged, much like this one. How much more likely would people be to use electric vehicles if they already had the infrastructure for them in their homes? Well, statistics say they're about 28% more likely. Perfect. Now we can make considering the environment our standard for homeowners. But that's not what happened in reality. In 2011, the ICC changed its voting process on new codes in such a way that it downplayed the voices of many important stakeholders, such as government representatives. This secret deal was published by the New York Times in 2019, where it was revealed that the deal guaranteed industry representatives 4 of just 11 voting seats on 2 powerful committees. In 2019, the ICC had the highest voter turnout ever. This was thanks to the hundreds of elected government officials who voted on the 2021 model building codes. They voted for the most energy efficient code ever in ICC history, with 10% improvements for new buildings, such as electric-ready wiring for appliances and charging ports for electric cars. However, in 2021, the ICC completely abandoned the idea of voting altogether. Although 75% of voters, but the majority submitted by local governments, opposed this change, open voting on the model building codes was suspended. This moved voting from a large open process to having codes be developed by small committees without input from government building officials who administer them, thereby excluding many experienced and quite knowledgeable stakeholders. If the ICC wants to keep their codes relevant and give our planet the best outlook for the future, they must go back to the old voting system and equally weigh all stakeholder voices. So as my partner discussed, the impact of ICC model building codes cannot be understated. Now, vehicles are usually assumed to be the most disastrous for the climate. After all, 71% of Americans believe that we should adopt tougher fuel efficiency standards for cars and trucks to reduce climate change. Nevertheless, transportation only contributes to 29% of greenhouse gas emissions. Meanwhile, buildings comprise 37% of climate emissions. In addition, the Energy Information Administration, which is a government organization, found that residential, commercial, and industrial buildings all consume more energy than transportation when combined. Of this energy used by buildings and construction, only 6% of it comes from renewable sources. In summary, the building codes the ICC implements has the potential to help mitigate the immense emission of pollutants and the consumption of energy that buildings create. This is why we are presenting to you, the ICC, that your organization must equally consider all stakeholders to meet your commitments to transparent code development that will benefit the community by promoting sustainability.
For our agenda today, we'll be discussing our proposal for the ICC to return to its open voting process through legal, financial, and ethical lenses. we'll present our course of action that we recommend to the ICC that will ensure a green and equitable future for all. With this, I would like to begin our analysis by having Sadie analyze the case from a legal perspective.
Let's take a look at the legal implications of this case. In the United States, building codes are not created or enforced by the federal government. Rather, they're enforced at state or local levels, and these jurisdictions often format their codes after the model codes that the ICC created. ICC model codes are a sort of bare bones for state and local codes that are strengthened but never weakened by respective jurisdictions. The ICC model codes are not meant to make situations harder on homeowners. For example, the ICC may include in its model codes to have areas to plug in electric stove and other appliances, even if the home is going to actually start out as gas powered. And this allows homeowners to have the option should they choose to go electric in the future, but not the requirement. But if they chose to go in the future because of government requirements or pure personal preference, that ability is now there and built into the home. If the ICC makes necessary changes in its codes, it will make it more likely that those changes will be adopted by the proper jurisdictions. For example, if the ICC puts greener insulation in its model codes that are not legally binding, then those insulation methods are more likely to be put in codes that are legally binding. If we want greener legally binding codes, we must have green model codes. Let's make considering all stakeholders, especially our shared environment, the bare minimum and hold ourselves to a higher standard. Legal progress will not occur until model code progress, driven by informed stakeholders, is accomplished. Some of the core issues regarding the ICC and its recent decisions have been a little murky, to say the least. For example, in 2021, the American Gas Association, or AGA, pushed to discard the following ICC model code recommendations: electric vehicle infrastructure, adding during construction to reduce costs; electrical outlets near gas equipment for allow for future transition, as mentioned earlier, and the discontinued use of continuously burning pilot lights. The AGA claimed these codes disadvantaged the competitiveness of natural gas and preempted the federal minimum efficiency standards under the Energy Policy and Conservation Act. The ICC board decided to sustain the appeal, thereby overturning the governmental vote. Federal courts have determined that there is a building code exemption that is not in favor of appellants like the AGA. And this exemption allows state and local governments to set energy efficiency targets that exceed federal standards. Along with the AGA, though, building industry heavyweights appealed 25 measures that ICC voters had overwhelmingly approved. The ICC's 3-member appeals board overturned 5 provisions, including requiring builders to include circuitry for electric vehicle hookups. Additionally, one of the 3 appeals board members was Ann Anderson, a longtime member of the National Association of Homeowners, who has worked closely with the group's code-making process. A government official stated in response to this, as you can see on the screen, quote, "You had a person with deep relations to the NAHB who was put on a 3-person appeals board that's going to make a decision on an NAHB-filed appeal," close quote. While there was nothing explicitly illegal about these activities, the waters were made pretty murky, thus making the ICC less trustworthy in the eyes of its stakeholders. Now that we've taken a look at the basic legal key issues of this case, we will turn over to my colleague Audrey, who will discuss the financial benefits of including stakeholders in ICC code process and subsequently implementing green technologies into new building codes.
Now, I will be discussing how the changes that the ICC implements to the building code approval process can affect the financial welfare of current communities and future posterity. To begin this discussion, it is essential to understand how much influence the ICC holds over long-term energy usage. The changes that the ICC made to model code voting can be clearly seen by following a graph from the ICC website. And it shows that from 2006 to 2012, energy efficiency increased by 37%. And I would just like to take a moment here to congratulate you for this amazing accomplishment, because this is a great deal. You were able to create great change to benefit the community and the environment in only 6 years. However, these achievements have been set back in preceding years due to the changes that have been made to your approval process. As the ICC, as you began increasing the involvement of industry representatives in committee hearings starting in 2011, energy usage failed to continue its previous downward trends, making a mere 1% improvement from 2008 to 2020 to 2019. In other words, this graph shows that building energy codes are proven to be an incredibly effective tool to reduce energy in homes and businesses. This lack of improvements seen in energy efficiency from 2009 to 2018 is extremely concerning when considering the numerous financial benefits energy reallocation and reduction can have. First, building codes save homeowners money by reducing long-term energy and utility expenses. Between 2006 and 2012, the changes that the ICC made saved homeowners 32% in energy costs. It is estimated that a home built with the 2012 ICC codes saves around half the energy of a standard home constructed in 1975, and there is still room for improvement. Second, model codes address energy efficiency and pollution emissions at some of the lowest cost. Building codes are the low-hanging fruit when it comes to environmental policy, because improving infrastructure provides immediate financial and environmental benefits. Small incremental building code updates can have large repercussions. It is estimated that the ICC model building codes will save $138 billion in cumulative energy costs by 2040 for homes and businesses. And that is around $162 in annual savings per residential unit. This will be the equivalent of reducing emissions by 245 large coal power plants. Thirdly, since the climate is changing, so too must our building codes. While there being many wide-ranging economic effects of global warming, we must take every opportunity to reduce climate change impacts in America's building sector. We need building codes that are aimed at cutting energy usage within homes and offices, thereby reducing the need to burn fossil fuels and avoiding the associated harmful carbon pollution that is fueling climate change. And we frankly cannot meet the energy goals of tomorrow without improving building efficiency and sustainability today. Lastly, building infrastructure decreases the transition time to more sustainable technology, such as electric vehicles. Because implementing sustainable building practices can have high short-term costs, many households and organizations may avoid energy efficiency upgrades, even if the return on investment is exponential, as we have already shown. For example, a survey found that 71% of drivers say that they would consider buying an electric car in the future, yet 76% of the drivers replied that they would not upgrade to an electric vehicle soon or ever, since electric vehicle charging points are lacking in public parking and private homes. Since building codes can have such great impacts on energy efficiency and climate change, it is a shame to think that the ICC missed the opportunity to continue making such dramatic improvements in building codes since 2012. But when examining the codes that the ICC has implemented or has proposed implementing, there are two main categories. The first is technological upgrades. Building codes can motivate homeowners to keep pace with technological advances, which increase energy efficiency and financial savings. And this can be accomplished through changes in building infrastructure, such as lighting retrofits, boiler replacements, air sealing, and solar panels. The second is preventative installation. Building codes with future-focused technology that aim to cut consumer costs and harmful pollution while supporting the transition to a cleaner economy. And this is done through electric heating pumps, electric outlets by gas stoves, and electric vehicle outlets, which, as my partner discussed in the previous section, were not implemented in the 2021 ICC building codes due to what appears to be a conflict of interest. So when thinking about the benefits that have evolved, if the ICC had not appealed the electric vehicle circuitry recommendation in the 2021 model codes, what benefits could we have possibly seen? Well, there are many. For example, electric car sales have tripled in 2021, now representing 9% of the global market, and that number is just going to keep going up. And based on this, there was a study conducted in California that was examining how EV infrastructure costs could change in construction with a parking lot. This study found that it's significantly more expensive to renovate a parking lot with EV equipment, costing $920 to install at initial construction, and this is for 2 parking spaces that have circuitry set up for electric vehicles. But it would be $3,550 to complete a retrofit of that parking lot to have 2 parking spaces for electric vehicles. So this is a $2,630 in cost savings produced just by installing electric vehicle infrastructure during initial construction instead of doing a retrofit later on. So this is why the ICC voters, governmental voters, proposed adding electric vehicle circuitry to the 2021 model codes. But unfortunately, we know that this was not implemented. Now that we have talked about the financial implications and impacts, my colleague Ahmadine will discuss the heart of the issue of why we are presenting here to the ICC today. And that is our ethical concerns about your decision to exclude stakeholders and prioritize industry representatives in your model code making processes.
Before we introduce our ethical concern, it is important that we acknowledge our stakeholders and affected parties, which includes the ICC, our environment, the American Gas Association and related corporations, construction companies, government officials, homeowners, and most importantly, our one and only planet. There are three main actions performed by the ICC that we would like to address today. First, the secret deal made in 2011, which restricted the voices of some members of the voting council and suspended the open voting process in favor of a council of elected representatives. Second, the formation of a 3-member appeal committee in 2019, which made it difficult to foster an environment for any real change to take place in. And third, the recent decision to suspend open voting puts the ICC at risk of becoming irrelevant and corrupt as it moves further and further away from serving its stakeholders. All three of these actions mentioned have created reasons for ethical concerns and can potentially give the illusion of a conflict of interest, as there's only been a mere 1% improvement in energy efficiency building codes since 2012, compared to the 37% we had seen prior to the recent series of events mentioned. Before we discuss a recommended approach, it's important for the ICC to consider organizations that are stakeholders with a conflict of interest that hinders some cities' goals to become more sustainable. A prime example is the city of Minneapolis. In 2017, nearly 3/4 of the city's emissions were from buildings as the city was accommodating to population growth and development. Although the city was mainly consuming renewable energy, however, emissions from natural gas used to heat buildings, stovetops, etc., were the main sources of carbon pollution. Initially, many local governments in Minnesota and all over the US registered to vote on the next ICC codes in 2019, and the winning codes were in favor of sustainable lifestyles using renewable energy. Shortly after, the NHAB requested the ICC reconsider the members who voted in 2019 to potentially appeal their decision under the argument that there had been an influx of ineligible voters. Eventually, the ICC's members established a 3-person team, one of which was a member of the AGA. This team eventually appealed 25 regulations, including codes that would facilitate switching to sustainable options in homes. The ICC's original model building codes had the potential to influence law that would make cities like Minneapolis more sustainable. Our proposition for the ICC is to consider an approach with the best outcomes for all stakeholders. The ICC should strive to do the greatest good for the well-being of society, which means making the decision that benefits the most and harms the least. With this approach, we recommend that the ICC reverses the course of the 2011 secret deal and refrain from prioritizing organizations with financial interests and underlying biases over stakeholders that are important but cannot necessarily speak for themselves, such as the environment. And lastly, overturn the decision in May 2021 immediately in order to strive to make tangible improvements in energy efficiency. With this recommended ethical approach, we do understand and recognize that some stakeholders may be more harmed than others. We also want to emphasize the importance of perceiving building codes as a long-term investment into homes, our environment, and the overall well-being of our planet. Some of the costs associated with our ethical approach is an increase in building codes for construction companies, real estate developers, which could potentially raise prices in the housing market for consumers. It is important to understand that these are short-term costs. Additionally, organizations such as the National Gas Association and other related corporations may be harmed as we become more aware of the damages of climate change and the importance of sustainable living. It is inevitable that we as a society will gravitate towards more sustainable lifestyles, and some sectors and industries will have to adapt to these changes. On the other hand, there are many benefits to our approach. The ICC has been a long-time trusted nonprofit organization with a great mission that has had a lot of impact over the last decades. However, the overall attitudes towards the ICC has changed during recent years. The organization has even faced scrutiny from Congress in regards to their close relationship with the American Gas Association. Some of the values of the ICC are member focus, integrity, and trust. However, by ending the open voting process and prioritizing organizations with conflicting values, one could rightfully argue that the ICC does not necessarily uphold these values to the highest standards. By following our proposed approach, the ICC will be able to regain the trust of the community and their credibility. As previously mentioned by my colleague Audrey, building codes modeled by the ICC were able to save homeowners 32% in energy costs, which means that in the long term, homeowners will actually be able to save more. It is also important to mention that it's cheaper to build homes that are easily adaptable to sustainable building codes while in construction, rather than installing them after construction. Also, by making private and commercial buildings more adaptable to systems such as solar panels and electric vehicle charging ports, it increases the property value in the long term. Lastly, we believe that by creating more sustainable codes, the ICC will be able to use its power and influence to help government officials around the world implement sustainable building codes to encourage sustainable living, reduce CO2 emissions, and prevent irreversible damages caused by climate change. To conclude our ethical discussion, we have some snapshots directly from the ICC's website. And I want to stress to you, ICC, of your amazing commitments and the values that your organization was built on. But how can the ICC uphold its vision and mission statement, which is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the people and prioritize the safety and performance of the building, if the people who have the community's best interest in mind do not have a voice in the voting process? How can the ICC create a fair balance of interests if members with obvious conflicts of interest can have the authority to appeal 25 regulations and overturn 5 of these measures voted on by local officials and building experts all over the United States? We want to remind you, the ICC, of the magnitude of the impact of your model building codes that has influenced nearly 1/3 of the world. And in less than 2 decades, your organization has been able to accomplish over 100+ years of work.
If the ICC decides to do the right thing by including all stakeholders in future decisions regarding model codes, it will aid in the progression of multiple other goals as well. First, giving the environment and its activists a fair voice in deciding the fate of model codes will inevitably lead to more green and sustainable buildings and subsequently communities in the future. If we want our communities to serve, protect, and bring value to us in the future, we must come together today to take necessary action. For the ICC, this means listening to all stakeholders equally rather than being overly influenced by one group or another. Furthermore, since a large function of ICC codes is to make future change possible rather than requiring immediate change, making model codes more sustainable will allow communities to be more resilient to changes in the future. Accomplishing a sustainable and fair future tomorrow means working together today. Sustainable buildings are an essential way to give everyone an easy access way to help build the future. But we can't get to this point without allowing everyone to have a voice in the conversation. Putting one party over the other is not an equitable path, and inequitable paths will not lead us to equitable futures. The ICC must hold itself accountable today to include all stakeholders in making effective decisions for all of us tomorrow.
The ICC holds a lot of influence, not only in the US, but also throughout the Caribbean islands, Latin America, and around the globe, as it has impacted nearly 2 billion lives. We strongly encourage that the ICC return to their pre-2011 state of open voting with equal consideration of all stakeholders. If the world is to see a future that is environmentally conscious, fair, and equitable, the ICC must reverse its decision from May 2021, which ended the open voting process for model code change and ratification. By having an open process, we can ensure that the individuals that are truly representative of society's best interests are heard. The ICC must return to its old voting method in order to achieve long-term investment into our future, our environment, our communities, and the one and only planet that we all share.
With that being said, let's work together to build a sustainable future. ICC, please use your platform to illuminate the future for all of us. Thank you.
I got that. Thanks for your presentation. Thanks for your discussion and the work in preparation that went into your efforts. I have a couple of questions I want to kind of talk through. I want to let the other members of the group ask questions as well. First of all, who is it that pays ICC? How is the organization funded?
From our information, we know that it is funded by different sponsors. For example, the American Gas Association, the Indiana Association of Carpenters, around other different industry groups, nonprofits, and also a lot of laboratories also sponsor the ICC. But beyond that, we're not exactly sure how you are funded.
Okay, thank you. Is that present perhaps a conflict of interest in that ICC is at least partially funded by industry groups that otherwise would possibly have an adverse outcome as a function of ICC codes and regulations? Is that at all a conflict of interest?
We believe that even if it's not a conflict of interest, it can appear as a conflict of interest, which is oftentimes just as bad as a conflict of interest itself in the eyes of stakeholders. And so that's why we're suggesting that they have open voting so that those industry representatives can have a voice, but so can other parties. So it kind of avoids that appearance of a conflict of interest.
Very good. Thank you. Are there other factors or other events that happened in around 2011-12 coincident to the change in structure that you discussed that may have also contributed to that obviously sharp inflection in terms of the improvement in efficiencies? Were there other factors beyond simply that change in how ICC was making decisions?
I'm not 100% sure exactly if there's an answer to that, but based on your website, you were discussing that the 37% of energy efficiency improvements was primarily made up by the code approval process implemented and the codes implemented by the ICC.
Just by way of clarification, what did we say when we made the change? In other words, why did we say publicly we were making the change at all, the change in voting status?
For which year are you referring to?
I'm sorry, when we went away from the democratic process by which you would like us to return, why did we say
in 2021
we were leaving that process? Yeah.
Yes. Okay. On your website, it was stated that it was to give governmental voters more of a voice and to more quickly implement code processes. However, many of the governmental representatives did not agree with that decision and were voicing that they felt like their recommendations and their expertise were being taken away from that process.
So you're saying we said the change was for one reason, but you think the change was actually for another reason?
I think ultimately it doesn't exactly matter why you made the change, even if it was for a good reason. I think that is a good thing. However, it does matter how the stakeholders view it and how it has affected them. And so since the stakeholders are saying one thing, you definitely should take that into account as your organization and with the commitments that you have made to hear their voice and listen and to at least reconsider the change that you did make.
To add on to what Audrey said, it's clear that the intentions of the ICC, they weren't bad intentions. They were intending to make the process quicker and move things along more easily, but that's just not what happened in reality, and that's why we suggested moving back to the old process.
In either process, how are dwellers represented in that process? The people who occupy these buildings, whether they be homes or others, are they, in other words, I'm still trying to understand what that change really did to the voice of the stakeholder of the person living or buying this house. How is that represented through the government in this instance, or is it represented in some other way?
To my
Oh, go ahead, Sadie.
To my understanding, the homeowners would be represented by their local government leaders because nobody knows what one particular community needs quite like their local government does. And so it's easier for those local government leaders rather than, federal leaders or state leaders to really understand what each individual community needs and vote as such.
However, many different people can vote in your voting process, such as students can even vote. You have to register and be approved and pay for that. So, but as my colleague Sadie was mentioning, a large portion of your voters are from the local governments because they know the needs of the community and how to best address them. So they can look at the ICC codes and see, oh, we think these would be best to implement in our communities and for our citizens, and can implement those.
So I have a question, and thank you so much for your presentation. Really appreciated the passion. I think my question is there a way to balance? Because I think that the potential to have just anybody sign up to vote, whether they have any knowledge or qualifications in the building space, is there a balance, or is there another option where there can be additional stakeholders represented without having literally thousands and thousands of people who may or may not have the right knowledge to apply with their vote?
I'm sure that the ICC could create a process for that. I will note that the number of stakeholders who would be voting in your code process, to our knowledge, that would not have the proper education to be applicable for voting is very low. For example, I think only 3% of your voters are students. And will that have that large of an impact? I'm not sure. However, the majority of your stakeholders are experts. They are government representatives, at least before 2021. So I'm sure a process could be created, but in all honesty, our organization does not see that it was a problem in the first place.
I see. So I wouldn't discount students as having appropriate knowledge if they're studying the building codes. I'm just trying to think about a way that if the true reason is, as you say, was maybe to streamline the process, to find a way to get representation without having literally thousands of people with input.
As Audrey mentioned earlier, there is also an application process to be a voter. So it's not just random people on the street that can put in their vote, but these students who are voting and people in industries that aren't necessarily building code industries related to that, they have to apply and they have to pay a fee. So there has to be some inner driver there too. So they have to have something at stake.
Okay, thank you for that.
Oh, sorry. And just to add one more thing, and even then they don't vote on the larger committees. There's a general voting process, and then those codes move up to committees. So like the federal government.
Hey, good afternoon. Quick question from Santa Monica. As the most liberal, green, left member of the ICC, I concur 100% with your movement towards transparency. I wanted to ask you, why do you think there's a misalignment between industry and sustainability in the environment? Why do you think that the idea of regulatory capture, or what industry is pushing for, what's their rationale? Why are they trying to move in a direction that makes it more expensive and less sustainable and less environmentally friendly? It would seem like everybody's incentives ought to be aligned. So help me understand these capitalists.
I think that one of the obvious answers, especially when it comes to the American Gas Association, is sort of the tendency of possibly putting people like profit over individuals in our lives, in our planet. So it's, to a certain extent, it's a lot easier to continue not using renewable energy and just keep doing what we're doing. And a lot of these organizations have been resisting to this change. And as mentioned, as we continue to move towards a more sustainable world, it is going to be inevitable for them to sort of go through that shift within their industry. But as of right now, as we see, there's sort of like this pushback in terms of moving towards more sustainable building codes, because it would cost them more in the short term. But at the end of the day, it's our lives that are at stake. It's our planet that's at stake. So I think that also should be considered as well.
And I would also like to add on to that note that we're not blaming any businesses or corporations for what they're doing. They're looking out for their best interest, but we want to align their interests with those of our planet and of our communities. We want them to be able to make a profit, but also be able to implement change in the ideal world. So we're not placing blame on anyone, but we would like to help mitigate externalities that are being created by the system that we currently have.
Just a couple more questions for me. First of all, the inflection in 2011 or 12, if I follow, it was not a reversal of the trend in the context of improvements and improved efficiency in energy saving. Rather, it was simply a complete pause or stop in any further improvements. Do I understand correctly?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
Sure. So the inflection that occurred in 2011, 2012, wherein energy savings, efficiency improvements were significant and steady prior to that time, and then they just stopped altogether. That was purely any further improvements stopped, as opposed to they did not reverse. Do I understand correctly?
No, yes, correct. That they did not reverse, just no improvements were made following that.
Very good. Did y'all have a chance? You mentioned, and it's helpful to understand and be reminded, ICC operates in 55 countries. Are there other countries where any similar or related actions occurred where ICC policy and a shift in terms of focus or bias, either real or imagined, occurred at a similar time?
Personally, I'm not aware of any. I would have to go back and check the data that you had. This is from a graph from your website to see if that data was referring to just national in the US, those changes in code energy efficiency, or if it was internationally based. But as for specific examples, I do not have any at this time.
I think it's important to note, though, too, that the US is a leader globally. And so there is a responsibility there. So the actions that the ICC takes in the US or abroad, the ones in the US are going to be seen on a global stage. And so it's important that we do as much positive change as we can in the US so that it can be a catalyst for countries that are following in our footsteps.
Katie, thanks. That's an excellent point. Appreciate it.
And to add on to that as well, essentially the ICC sort of operates as like the United Nations of sustainability. They make recommendations, and their codes oftentimes sort of like inspire state and federal regulations for building codes as well. So whatever's passed in the US, just to echo what Stacey said, it sort of has an impact, as we mentioned, Latin America, the Caribbeans, because it's not necessarily binding for a government to apply these codes, but it sort of has like a large scale impact.
So I have another question, if I could step in here, because as somebody who has a strong focus on ethics and compliance, it gives me great pause to hear the potential that we may have a reputation of perhaps at a minimum having a conflict of interest, and probably worse, being corrupt. And so I guess I'd like to ask, do you have any recommendations as our consultant on anything else that we can do to address the reputational issues that you have pointed out in the presentation, in ways to become more transparent beyond changing the voting process? Just thinking about just the way we have structured our organization and the way we operate.
Well, I'll go first. I'm sure my colleagues will have some other points to add, but I think the main thing is communication. Ultimately, the ICC has lacked giving information to the public. The 2021 code process changed, and there have been lots of complaints from government representatives around that, and lots of articles by private organizations published about it, but you don't have on your website or available to any public member that is not part of your organization how the code process changed. Additionally, when thinking about Annie Anderson on the 3-person appeals committee, that was denied by the ICC. It was brought forth towards them, and several different organizations and news outlets were asking for information about this, were asking for the minutes, and it was denied by the ICC until you simply couldn't anymore. And so I think really being open and transparent about what exactly has been going on and communicating with your stakeholders is the best way to help you repair what has been damaged and to help restore the reputation, because ultimately you are founded on great ideals, great values, but you're at risk of becoming irrelevant, because if your main goals are to promote energy efficiency and helping improve buildings and reduce climate emissions, and that's not what your codes are doing, then people will stop using them. And then what will your organization be here for? So really just being open about that and talking to your stakeholders is really something that we think will help you in achieving this goal.
Great. Thank you for that answer. Appreciate it.
I completely agree with Audrey. I think that one of the big issues with ICC reputation right now is that the change in voting process wasn't brought to, the community's attention by the ICC. It was brought by a New York Times expose. And if it's brought forth in an expose, it's already going to look 100 times worse than it is. And so that's a big issue. But if the ICC would be able to come forward, that would establish a base of trust. And there's a common quote in the ethics community. I can't remember exactly who said it, but it's that trust is golden, don't break it for anything. And if you have an appearance of a conflict of interest, you're breaking trust, that's golden. And that's where the issues are. So if you're coming forward and saying, look, we might have messed up, but here's our intention and here's what we're going to do going forward, I think that could benefit the company a lot, or the organization a lot, rather.
Thank you. Very good advice.
Quick last question from me. I want to thank you. As you mentioned, trust is valuable, optics, the value of brand and reputation, all super important. Earlier, you touched on just the idea that organizations act in their best interest. How can you help us quantify the benefit of our reputation, how we're seen relative to what some of the other members of the board are worried about our corporate contributions and our ability to be a sustainable organization going forward? How should we be thinking about those two? You touched on it a bit, but how do we quantify that so some of our more empirical members have something that they can hold on to when they're thinking about the value of trust and reputation and brand?
I'd like to take this one. So it's kind of like a domino effect, right? So if your codes are not being voted on by stakeholders and local governments are the ones who adopt those codes, if they're frustrated with what's happening, they're going to stop adopting them. And then businesses that are donating to the ICC, they have nothing to gain because ICC codes aren't relevant. So why would they donate in the first place? They don't have any benefit to their business. They don't get any profits. They don't get an upper hand because the ICC is irrelevant because the people who adopt them are not happy with them and they're not using the codes anymore. So it's kind of like it's like a pyramid. If you take out the people at the bottom, the local government leaders, then there's no need for profits or anything else at the top. It just crumbles.
So in some ways, this is kind of a question that goes back in time, and it's a much lower level question than I think my colleagues are asking, but cost is not irrelevant, right? So the stakeholders that you're also asking to be a part have cost concerns, regardless of who they are. If they're, the sellers of products, or if they're buyers of houses, people who want affordable housing and a place to live. You touched very briefly on cost, but where does cost play into all of this? Like, in other words, I don't think anyone's disputing that, that closing off these externalities and making the environment a more important focus of our building. I don't think anyone's really disputing that, but all of these things come with a cost, and that is a value of, if no one else, the consumer who lives in the house. To what degree should we be worried about the cost that we're essentially imposing on the person who has to buy this house?
That's a very good question. And cost cannot be understated because it is expensive to implement sustainability changes. And one thing that we think is important and that we were actually discussing is how will this affect specifically minority communities? If the ICC has these codes, or communities that are more impoverished, how will these codes affect them? Because it will increase costs. And it is important to note that government representatives play a huge part here because they're supposed to know what their communities need. And so if they see certain codes and they increase costs, they can decide where is best to implement them in their communities. So they can know which codes to avoid for certain communities and help more equally distribute this burden of cost in their areas of expertise. And it's also, I think, a great point to mention that these costs will pay themselves back in the future, and that they're only really being established into new constructions. For example, the electric vehicle outlets, they're not recommending that you add them to a home that you have now or to a parking lot that you have now. They're recommending that people who build them add them while they're building them, so they don't have to do a retrofit. And generally, people who are building houses or building parking lots are going to have the funds to pay an extra $1,000 to add the circuitry in for that code specifically. So these codes will pay back, and that's why you need the government representatives to have your back so that they can implement these codes and these burdens of costs in a way that is equitable for everyone.
I mean, it's an interesting point you bring up there, because I help build habitat houses, and I'm trying to imagine the code that would require me to put in that type of adapter into a habitat house and how that would add costs directly to somebody who wouldn't use it. And I'm trying to figure out, like, to what degree. So your answer does touch on that, and I guess that's kind of where I'm getting to, is these will increase costs for a lot of people that have no interest in these particular advancements. And so to what degree does my organization have an obligation to consider those people in these changes?
One analogy that I like to use to help myself understand it is thinking of the World Health Organization during COVID-19. So they looked at the situation, they had the data that they collected, and they had recommendations for everybody around the world to use to address the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, different countries, even if you look in the US, different states, they took those recommendations and they applied them differently based on different needs. In Florida, things were open a lot faster than in California because that's the local communities wanted or needed. And so that's kind of how the ICC works. They collect data, they collect information, and they make a recommendation. And communities can take those recommendations, or for example, the habitat community could take those recommendations, and if they're like, look, we don't need an electric vehicle outlet in this community, you don't have to take the code, it's a recommendation. But if you have a really up and coming neighborhood that can afford to put the electric vehicle outlets, and it seems like a promising expenditure, then they will put them in. And so that's kind of how I think of it myself.
And that's a great answer. My concern, though, is, of course, that, like you said, these codes are adopted by municipalities in which it applies to every building within that municipality. So, but thank you for addressing it. I mean, I'm not sure there's a great answer, but thank you very much for that.
Let's take a pause for Q&A. That was really helpful. I'd like to have a chance to give the team some feedback on a couple of things. First of all, any of the judges know why this group is called Top Hat Consulting? I know the Stetson team does.
I don't.
The Hatters, which is a great mascot name. I lived in Florida for a while. I love that. I love that. That's not important, however. You guys did a really good job with a challenging topic. I really valued the commitment and the passion and the energy you guys brought. This is a complex topic, particularly when one considers the trade-offs. Regulatory issues are always challenging and complex, and this is clearly one that has regulatory implications. And certainly, climate change is a complex topic all around. But you guys, a couple of things you did really well. When you did not know the answer, you didn't try to avoid the question. You said right away, "We don't know," or you addressed it head on. Please keep. I struggle with that every day with my team in corporate America. Another thing is, you guys had strength and conviction around your recommendations. Dean, the way you communicated was both very clear in a professional sense, but also it was also clear that you had a strong sense of conviction of what your feedback and replies were for the questions that are being asked. Please keep that up as well. It makes it more effective, and there is a place in corporate America for folks to have a strength of convictions, provided they back it up with facts and data. That's how we make decisions. Questions like, who pays ICC? That is a huge deal in regulatory issues and where there are conflicts of interest. So as you think about conflict of interest or ethical issues in the future, think about who's paying for it, okay? Because inevitably that's going to put somebody's fingers on the scales and how it affects outcomes and how decisions are made. It's difficult for an independent body, particularly one that's a nonprofit, to remain beyond the influence of whoever's paying you. Okay, it's true everywhere. Okay, I really like how you ID'd your stakeholders. That's really important because it is there are multiple folks involved. This is not a black and white cause-effect relationship in terms of the dynamics and the considerations you guys were discussing. So those were some of the things that made an impression on me. I liked your phrase balance of interest. That's a good way to reflect nothing is ever again clear and easy. As I'm fond of saying, I work in R&D, beware the man with simple solutions for complex problems. And this clearly is one. Okay, so thank you for your research. Thank you for your effort. I learned some things today. I'm glad I got up to hear this presentation. I want to let the other judges share their feedback as well.
Sure, I'll jump in if that's all right.
Absolutely, Fred.
First, I want to say congratulations. Your preparation shines right through, and I just want to tip my cap. I think that having the perspective on ethics and recognizing climate as an important issue are two super important things that I want to laud you for. I want to hit on a couple things for you to think about. One is when we're dealing with ethics and a lot of other things in a corporate setting, they're qualitative and they're emotional. And a lot of decision makers want to see an effort put towards some sort of empirical or quantitative perspective on it. And I think you were scratching at it. And I think that going forward, just thinking about it, trying to find ways that you can put numbers or scenarios or examples. I love the example of you saying, it could be a house of cards. If you don't maintain your reputation, it would be great to say, like this happened to this other quasi-regulatory body or this other NGO, or in this other example. I think that could have really been great. Also, I thought that John asked a really good question, scratched on it, and I know it was in the moment, but I think there are a lot of other things related to kind of the cost of ownership, the resale value, the impact on the environment, all those things thought of in the totality of interest may be relevant to his concern. Then just small nits, there are a few spelling errors on the slides. Just a little bit of that could for some people be a distraction. So just keep an eye on that with respect to proofreading. And then the other thing for me was just a little bit just emotive. That I on one hand, I love the passion, and I really love that you really want this to be better. On the other hand, the technique of trying to convince your client on how to make changes that you want to be, or one way to go about it is to help them understand and to be their advocate. I'm concerned that your reputation is suffering. I see this as one of your long-term issues of sustainability is a lack of trust. You've got an optical problem, and here's some suggestions on how to fix it. That just in terms of how suggestions are received, that could be helpful in getting people to take your recommendations. That being said, I want to congratulate you, and I appreciate all your hard work.
So I'll add a few more thoughts. I agree with the comments of my fellow judges, and I really do want to congratulate you because it's clear you did a lot of homework. You did a lot of research on this, and I felt like you did a little bit of reading on the presentations, but when you got to the Q&A, it's very clear to me that you know this, you got this, and that you probably can rely a little bit less on your notes and stick with what you clearly knew and knew so well when we got to the Q&A. So I want my comment to be a confidence builder that you guys know it and that you were comfortable in your answers. So kudos to you on the amount of work that you did to get to the confidence level that you had. I do think, and Fred was touching on it, it's a fine line in terms of pulling back the curtain, if you will, on an organization, and on an organization that that clearly has some perception issues, as you were describing. And so, the one thing I actually wasn't sure about was the secret deal. And you mentioned secret deal a couple of times. Do you know, maybe just to think about it for tomorrow, is that something that you want to explain or perhaps define in a more knowledgeable term? Because I think the kinds of things that might put us as the client on the defensive versus really taking in what you're recommending. And I think you did a pretty good job of walking that fine line, because like I said, it's hard to pull back the curtain and say, hey, you guys don't really understand the damage that this has done to your reputation. And it's an important message to deliver. And it's not an easy one to deliver, for sure. So I think that you walk the fine line pretty well. I would just maybe address the secret deal and take Fred's comments into account in terms of some other ways as well that you could think about presenting that. But I was just so impressed with the passion and the knowledge and the work that you all did. Congratulations. And, you've got me ready to go be studying up on ICC really soon. So thank you for all of your hard work. And I wish you the best as you move through this process, but I think you did a phenomenal job. So thank you.
I think everybody has said more or less what I was going to say. So I'll keep this as short as I can, and just simply to make an observation rather than it's certainly not a criticism as much as it's just an observation about your argument that might come up at some future time. So I understood your argument to be that you really wanted to return this organization to a much more democratic process of voting, that was the fundamental kind of argument behind what you were wanting to do. And the reason you wanted to return to this much more democratic way of voting on these provisions was because you also wanted to bring about a more equitable way of dealing with these, what has been called a balance of interests, is what you guys are calling it, right? That there are these lots and lots of different considerations that need to be taken into account and need to be kind of hashed through. And the best way to deal with that, rather than having somebody's thumb on the scale, your argument, I believe, is that the best way to deal with that exchange is through this more democratic process. So my observation about your argument is, would you still hold on to that argument if it led to less sustainable outcomes, right? So in other words, if your argument is about democracy, then I think you need to make a stronger argument about democracy. If your argument is about environmental sustainability, then maybe, in other words, is your argument actually trying to put your thumb on the scale to get the outcome that you want? That's my only kind of question about the argument. In other words, are you going for democracy because it is an equal balance of power, or are you going for democracy because it gives you the ability to get what you want out of the process? And I think there's kind of an inherent contradiction in that you might be asked to address at some point later on. And I don't think there's a bad answer there again, but maybe I'll just conclude by saying, this is a trade-off type of thing. It's a question of how are we deciding between lots of different goods, and what is the best process for making these very difficult choices where some interests are going to win and some interests are going to lose. Democracy is a pretty good way of dealing with that, but it may not get you the outcome that you want. So you get to struggle with that as well as the rest of us in civilization. So good luck to you.
Any other feedback or thoughts from the judges? Okay. And by the way, Carrie, Fred, John, thanks so much again for your time. You guys were among the best judging groups I've ever been part of. Great balance of feedback. Fred, each of you, I learned some things. Two last minor points I want to mention to Audrey, Sadie, and Amandine. First of all, there's a word in your handout, and I'll probably mispronounce it. Is it deontological or deontological? I was curious what it meant.
I can touch on that. Deontological, it's an ethical approach. We try not to use the word in the presentation itself because it is more of an academic term for it, but it's basically doing the right thing because it's the right thing. It was proposed by Kant.
Oh, that's excellent. I'm gonna use that tomorrow in a one-on-one, but I'm not gonna give any credit to where it came from. Okay, otherwise I want to mention with the word corrupt. Corrupt is a sort of definition in the context of legal and ethical terms. It typically means your decision-making is being distorted by virtue of what's frequently a monetary interest. I tend to just use the word in the context of bad decision-making or distorted decision-making, but it typically has a more specific meaning that way. Anyway, again, thanks for coming from Florida. Great job to a group of hatters who really were well prepared. We appreciate it. Best of luck going forward. That's all we have, folks. For judges, please turn in your feedback forms. I look forward to seeing you guys again in a future group. Take care.
Take care.
To the
Bye-bye.
presenters, just a friendly reminder before you go, reach out to Tom with who's presenting tomorrow, just in case you haven't already.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank
Y'all
you.
take care. Have a good one.